You'd want to hug him.
Yeah.
And he always remained, he still is a fan.
At 72, Sharon Osbourne has survived storms that would have destroyed most people. Cancer, betrayal, family addiction, public scandals. But nothing prepared her for the phone call that came in early 2023 when doctors delivered news that made her blood run cold. The tests were back and they weren't good. Sharon had been feeling off for months. Fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, dizzy spells that came without warning, moments where her legendary sharp tongue felt thick and useless. Friends noticed she was moving slower, speaking softer, canceling appearances she would have powered through just years before. At first, she brushed it off as aging, as stress from decades of carrying everyone else's burdens. But when she collapsed in her Buckinghamshire kitchen one morning, with only her housekeeper there to catch her fall, Sharon finally admitted what she'd been avoiding. Her body was failing her. The medical tests that followed were a nightmare of waiting rooms and worried whispers. Blood work, brain scans, heart monitoring, specialists passing her file between them like a puzzle they couldn't solve. Sharon sat through appointment after appointment, watching doctors' faces change as they reviewed her results, seeing the careful concern they tried to hide behind professional smiles. When the diagnosis finally came, it wasn't cancer returning.
I also had the gene for breast cancer,
Yeah.
but I chose myself.
Though that fear had haunted every sleepless night. It was something else, something that would change everything about how she lived, how she worked, how she existed in the world. The doctors spoke in careful medical terms about neurological decline, about medication that might slow the progression but couldn't stop it, about lifestyle changes that sounded like preparation for surrender. Sharon listened to it all with the steel composure that had carried her through 4 decades in the music industry. She asked the practical questions, demanded the brutal honesty, refused to let them soften the blow with false hope. But when she walked out of that medical office and sat alone in her car, the mask finally cracked. For the first time since Ozzy's darkest days, Sharon Osbourne wept like a broken woman. The cruelest part wasn't the diagnosis itself. It was the timing. Just when Sharon thought she'd earned some peace, when the chaos of raising 3 children through addiction and fame had finally settled, when she and Ozzy had found their rhythm again after the betrayal that nearly ended their marriage, life delivered another crushing blow. At 72, when most people her age were settling into quiet retirement, Sharon was facing a new kind of war. But this wasn't just about her anymore. Ozzy, now 75 and battling his own health demons with Parkinson's disease, depended on her more than ever. Their daily routine had become a careful dance around his limitations, his trembling hands, his shuffling walk, his moments of confusion that broke her heart. Sharon had become his memory when his failed, his voice when speech became difficult, his strength when his own body betrayed him. Now she was supposed to tell him that she was breaking down too. The conversation happened on a quiet Tuesday evening in their living room, the same space where they'd weathered countless storms together. Sharon had rehearsed the words for days, trying to find a way to deliver devastating news without destroying the man who still called her his lifeline. But when the moment came, all her carefully planned speeches crumbled. "Ozzy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk about something serious." His reaction wasn't what she expected. There was no panic, no denial, no dramatic breakdown. Instead, Ozzy Osbourne, the man who'd screamed his way through 5 decades of chaos, simply reached for her hand and held it with the steadiness of someone who understood that their time for pretending was over. "How bad is it?" he asked, his words slurred by medication but his eyes completely clear. Sharon told him everything. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the reality that she couldn't be his caretaker forever. She watched his face process each brutal detail, saw him absorb the weight of what this meant for both of them. When she finished, they sat in silence for what felt like hours, 2 legends facing the most human truth of all, that even love can't stop time from stealing everything. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in stubborn dignity. Sharon refused to become an invalid overnight, pushing herself through daily routines that exhausted her, maintaining the fierce independence that had defined her entire life. She continued managing Ozzy's care, overseeing his medical appointments, coordinating with their children about the future none of them wanted to discuss. But the signs were becoming impossible to hide. Sharon would lose her train of thought mid-sentence during business calls, forget meetings she'd scheduled herself, struggle with simple tasks that had once been second nature. The woman who'd built an empire on razor-sharp instincts was watching her most reliable tools slip away piece by piece. The family meetings started quietly, conversations disguised as casual dinners where Jack, Kelly, and Amy tried to assess how much help their parents really needed. Sharon could see the worry in their eyes, the way they watched her movements, listened to her words, searched for signs of how fast she was declining. It was the same look she'd given Ozzy during his worst periods, and now it was turned on her. The hardest part was admitting that the woman who'd spent decades solving everyone else's problems now needed solutions of her own. Sharon had always been the strong one, the fixer, the person who held everything together when the world fell apart. Now, for the first time in her adult life, she was the one who needed saving. And at 72, with her health failing and her husband slipping deeper into his own medical battles, Sharon Osbourne was facing the terrifying possibility that there might not be anyone left strong enough to catch her when she fell. The cracks in the Osbourne family foundation had been spreading for years, hidden beneath the gloss of celebrity success and the myth of unbreakable bonds. But by 2024, with Sharon's health declining and Ozzy's Parkinson's advancing, those hairline fractures exploded into chasms that threatened to destroy everything she'd spent decades building. It started with the money. Not the lack of it, but the overwhelming weight of managing a fortune estimated at over $220 million while watching her own mind slip away piece by piece. Sharon had always been the family's financial mastermind, the woman who turned Ozzy's chaos into cash, who built Ozfist from nothing, who negotiated deals that made other managers weep with envy. Now, as her cognitive abilities fluctuated, simple decisions became monumental struggles. The first sign came during a routine meeting with their wealth managers. Sharon sat at the polished conference table, surrounded by papers that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. Numbers that once danced clearly in her mind now swirled together in meaningless patterns. When the lead advisor asked her to sign off on a trust restructuring she'd personally designed 6 months earlier, Sharon stared at the documents like they belonged to a stranger. "I need time to review this," she said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. But time was exactly what she didn't have. Every day that passed without proper estate planning was another day closer to potential disaster. Sharon knew the statistics, had seen what happened to other celebrity families when illness struck without preparation. Fortunes vanished into legal battles, children turned against each other, legacies crumbled into bitter lawsuits that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. The family meetings that followed were brutal in their necessity. Jack, Kelly, and Amy gathered in Sharon's living room for conversations that felt more like corporate takeovers than loving interventions. Each child brought their own perspective, their own fears, their own barely concealed resentment about how their parents' fame had shaped their lives. Jack, now a father himself, approached the situation with the pragmatism of someone who'd battled his own demons and won. He wanted clear structures, defined roles, professional management that wouldn't depend on Sharon's declining abilities. His suggestions were logical, responsible, and completely devastating to a woman who'd built her identity on being indispensable. "Mom, you can't keep pretending you can handle everything," he said during one particularly tense evening. "We need systems in place before you get worse." The word "worse" hung in the air like a death sentence. Sharon had always hated being managed, had fired assistants for trying to organize her chaos, had built an empire on instinct and gut feelings that couldn't be systematized or delegated. Now her own son was suggesting she step back from the very thing that defined her. Kelly's approach was different but equally painful. As the family's public face in recent years, she understood better than anyone how Sharon's condition would affect their brand, their business relationships, their ability to maintain the empire they'd all inherited. Her concerns were valid but felt like betrayal to Sharon, who heard only criticism of her failing abilities. "People are already starting to talk," Kelly admitted during one family conference call. "The way you handled that last interview, forgetting names, losing your train of thought, it's going to hurt Dad's legacy if we're not careful." Sharon absorbed this like a physical blow. The idea that her decline could damage Ozzy's reputation, could tarnish the legacy she'd spent 40 years building and protecting, was almost unbearable. She'd always been his shield against the world's cruelty. Now she was becoming the source of potential damage. But it was Amy's silence that cut deepest. The daughter who'd always maintained distance from the family's public life now seemed to be pulling away entirely. She attended the necessary meetings, signed the required documents, but her emotional absence was palpable. Sharon could see in Amy's eyes the same look she'd once given her own father, love mixed with exhaustion, duty battling against the desire to escape. The practical discussions were excruciating. Power of attorney documents that meant admitting she couldn't trust her own judgment. Medical directives that forced her to confront the progression of her condition. Financial structures that assumed she'd become incapacitated, that planned for a future where Sharon Osbourne was no longer capable of being Sharon Osbourne. Each signature felt like signing away pieces of herself. The woman who'd never backed down from a fight was being asked to surrender control of her life to the very people she'd spent decades protecting from having to make these kinds of decisions. The conversations about Ozzy's care were the most brutal of all. His Parkinson's was progressing, his needs becoming more complex, his moments of confusion more frequent. Sharon had been his primary caregiver, the one person who understood his rhythms, his medications, his moods. Now the family had to plan for a reality where she couldn't fulfill that role. "We need to start looking at professional care options," Jack said during one meeting, his voice gentle but firm. "For both of you." The words hit Sharon like bullets. Professional care meant strangers in their home, people who didn't understand that Ozzy needed his coffee at exactly 9:15, who wouldn't know that his trembling was worse when he was anxious, who couldn't read the subtle signs that meant he was having a bad day. It meant admitting that her love wasn't enough to sustain him anymore. But perhaps the cruelest revelation was how differently each family member viewed their shared history. Stories Sharon remembered as triumphs were recalled by her children as traumas. Moments she thought brought them closer together had actually driven wedges between them that never healed. The reality show years, which Sharon saw as sharing their love with the world, were described by her kids as an invasion that stole their privacy and normalized their dysfunction. "You never asked us if we wanted our problems broadcast to millions of people," Amy said during one particularly heated exchange. "You just decided that our pain was content." These words shattered something inside Sharon that she hadn't realized was still whole. The possibility that her efforts to provide for her family, to build something lasting from Ozzy's talent, had actually harmed the people she loved most was almost too devastating to process. The late-night calls started then. Sharon would lie awake at 3 a.m., her mind spinning with worry and regret, and find herself dialing each of her children's numbers just to hear their voices. Sometimes they answered, sometimes they didn't. The times they didn't hurt worst of all, because Sharon couldn't tell if they were asleep or simply too exhausted by her needs to pick up the phone. The family that had once been united by chaos was now being torn apart by the very real prospect of loss. And Sharon, the woman who'd held them all together through addiction, scandal, and heartbreak, was discovering that facing mortality while watching your family fracture might be the cruelest tragedy of all. The entertainment industry that had made Sharon Osbourne a household name was about to show her just how quickly fame could turn into exile. In March 2021, what started as a heated discussion on the talk about racism accusations against Piers Morgan exploded into a career-ending scandal that would haunt Sharon for years to come. For over a decade, Sharon had been a fixture on the CBS daytime show, bringing her trademark sharp wit and brutal honesty to discussions about everything from celebrity gossip to serious social issues. She was the fearless one, the woman who said what others only thought, who could make audiences laugh one moment and think deeply the next. The talk had become her kingdom, and she ruled it with the same iron fist that had built the Osbourne empire. But on that March afternoon, defending her longtime friend Piers Morgan against racism allegations, Sharon made a series of statements that would destroy everything she'd built in television. The conversation with her co-host Cheryl Underwood grew heated, with Sharon demanding to know how Morgan's criticism of Meghan Markle made him racist. Her voice rose, her face flushed with anger, and in that moment of frustration, she uttered words that would define her downfall. "I feel like I'm about to be put in the electric chair because I have a friend who many people think is racist. So that makes me a racist," Sharon said, her voice cracking with emotion. What happened next was a masterclass in how quickly public opinion can destroy a career. Within hours, clips of the confrontation were everywhere. Social media exploded with condemnation. The hashtag Fire Sharon Osbourne began trending worldwide. The woman who had survived cancer, family addiction, and decades of rock and roll chaos was being canceled by the very audience that had once adored her. The aftermath was swift and merciless. CBS launched an internal investigation, placing the talk on hiatus while they reviewed the incident. Sharon's co-hosts distanced themselves publicly, releasing statements about having difficult conversations and learning from the experience. Former colleagues came forward with stories about Sharon's alleged behavior behind the scenes, painting a picture of someone who was difficult to work with and insensitive to issues of race and diversity. But the cruelest cut came from the network executives who had once courted her. These were people who had begged her to join the talk, who had celebrated her ratings success, who had praised her authenticity and fearlessness. Now they spoke in carefully worded statements about diversity and inclusion and creating a safe workplace environment, corporate speak that translated to one simple message: Sharon Osbourne was no longer welcome. The investigation stretched for weeks, each day bringing new leaks to the press about Sharon's alleged misconduct. Stories emerged about heated backstage arguments, claims of inappropriate comments, accusations that painted her as someone who had created a hostile work environment. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, Sharon had already been convicted. She tried to fight back, releasing carefully crafted apologies and explanations. She hired crisis management firms, gave interviews trying to clarify her statements, even underwent what she called racial sensitivity training. But nothing could stop the avalanche. Corporate sponsors began pulling their support, fearful of being associated with the controversy. Industry colleagues who had once returned her calls now went silent. The final blow came in April 2021, when CBS announced that Sharon would not be returning to the talk. The statement was coldly professional. Sharon Osbourne has decided to leave the talk. The events of the March 10 episode were upsetting to everyone involved, including the audience watching at home. As part of our review, we concluded that Sharon's behavior toward her co-hosts during the March 10 episode did not align with our values for a respectful workplace. 40 years in the entertainment industry, and it ended with a corporate press release that reduced her entire career to one heated conversation. The financial impact was immediate and devastating. Losing the talk meant losing a steady income that had supported not just Sharon's lifestyle, but her ability to manage Ozzy's expensive medical care. The show had paid her millions annually, money that had gone toward private nurses, cutting-edge treatments, the kind of care that made Ozzy's quality of life possible despite his Parkinson's diagnosis. But the money was nothing compared to the emotional devastation. Sharon had built her identity around being fearless, around speaking truth to power, around never backing down from a fight. The talk had given her a platform to be authentically herself, to connect with audiences who appreciated her honesty and humor. Losing that felt like losing a fundamental part of who she was. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Industry events that had once competed for her presence now avoided her entirely. Awards shows stopped extending invitations. The phone calls from producers and network executives dried up completely. Sharon found herself blacklisted from an industry she had helped shape for decades. Friends in the business began to distance themselves, fearful that association with her would damage their own careers. People who had called her for advice, who had celebrated at her parties, who had counted on her support during their own struggles, now crossed the street rather than acknowledge her presence. The loneliness was crushing for someone who had spent her entire adult life surrounded by the noise and energy of show business. The stress took a physical toll that compounded her existing health issues. Sleep became elusive, replaced by nights spent scrolling through social media, reading the endless stream of criticism and condemnation. Her appetite vanished, and friends noticed she was losing weight at an alarming rate. The woman who had always projected strength and control looked suddenly fragile, diminished by the relentless attacks on her character. Ozzy watched his wife's destruction with a mixture of rage and helplessness. The man who had built his career on being dangerous and unpredictable found himself powerless to protect the woman who had saved him countless times. His own health issues meant he couldn't be the support system Sharon needed, couldn't fight the battles she was facing. The role reversal was devastating for both of them. The legal battles began immediately. Sharon hired attorneys to explore her options, looking for ways to fight back against what she saw as an unfair character assassination. But entertainment law is unforgiving, and proving damage from a scandal like this is nearly impossible. The lawyers took her money and delivered bad news. There was little they could do to restore her reputation or recover her losses. Perhaps most painfully, Sharon had to confront the possibility that some of the criticism was justified. In quiet moments, away from the lawyers and crisis managers and public statements, She was forced to examine her own behavior over the decades. Had she been insensitive? Had her privilege blinded her to others' experiences? The self-reflection was agonizing for someone who had never doubted her own moral compass. The industry that had once celebrated her as a trailblazing female executive now treated her as a cautionary tale. Young women entering the business were warned not to follow in her footsteps, told that her downfall proved the dangers of being too outspoken, too controversial, too authentic in a world that demanded careful political calculation. 3 years later, at 72, Sharon still felt the sting of that betrayal. The entertainment industry had been her life's work, the thing she understood better than anything else, the arena where she had proven herself again and again. To be cast out so completely, so permanently, felt like a death while still breathing. The woman who had survived every storm now faced the cruelest exile of all, being forgotten by the very industry she had helped build. At 72, Sharon Osbourne found herself in the most unexpected battle of her life. Not against cancer, not against addiction, not against industry executives, but against time itself. With her health declining and the entertainment world having turned its back on her, Sharon was facing a truth that terrified her more than any diagnosis. The possibility that everything she'd built, everything she'd fought for, might disappear with her. The race began in earnest in late 2023, when Sharon's doctors delivered another blow that felt like a countdown timer starting. Her cognitive decline was accelerating, and the window for making crucial decisions about her legacy was shrinking faster than anyone had anticipated. The woman who had spent decades building the Osbourne brand now had to figure out how to preserve it while she still could. The first priority was Ozzy's care and dignity. His Parkinson's had progressed to the point where he needed round-the-clock assistance, and Sharon knew that her own declining abilities meant she couldn't be his primary caregiver much longer. But finding the right care wasn't just about medical expertise. It was about finding people who understood that they weren't just caring for an elderly patient. They were tending to a living legend whose comfort and dignity mattered as much as his physical health. Sharon threw herself into this task with the same intensity she'd once brought to negotiating record deals. She interviewed dozens of caregivers, toured facilities, consulted with specialists around the world. Every decision was filtered through one question: what would honor the man Ozzy had been while caring for the man he was becoming? The conversations with potential care providers were heartbreaking. Sharon found herself having to explain Ozzy's history, his needs, his quirks, to strangers who would never understand the full scope of what they were inheriting. How do you tell someone that the trembling man in the wheelchair once commanded stadiums of 100,000 people? How do you explain that his confused mumbling used to be the voice that defined heavy metal? But perhaps even more urgent was securing the family's financial future. The Osbourne empire was vast but complex, with revenue streams from music royalties, merchandise, licensing deals, and investments scattered across multiple entities. Sharon had always been the spider at the center of this web, the one person who understood how all the pieces fit together. Now she had to transfer that knowledge before it disappeared with her failing memory. The estate planning sessions were brutal marathons that left Sharon exhausted and frustrated. Lawyers and accountants who had once deferred to her expertise now had to patiently explain concepts she'd mastered decades ago, but could no longer grasp clearly. The numbers that had once danced in perfect clarity through her mind now felt foreign and intimidating. Jack stepped up during this period in ways that both relieved and broke Sharon's heart. Watching her son navigate the complexities of the family business with competence and care proved that he'd inherited more than just his parents' struggles with addiction. He had their resilience, their intelligence, their fierce protectiveness of family. But seeing him forced into this role also reminded Sharon how much her illness was stealing from everyone around her. The media legacy became another obsession. Sharon was painfully aware that her final years in the public eye had been defined by scandal and controversy rather than her decades of achievement. The talk incident had overshadowed everything else, and she couldn't bear the thought of being remembered primarily for those few heated moments rather than for the empire she'd built from nothing. Working with archivists and biographers, Sharon began the painstaking process of documenting her story in her own words while she still could. Hours of interviews, stacks of documents, boxes of photographs that told the real story of how a young woman from London had become one of the most powerful figures in rock music. Some days her memory was crystal clear, allowing her to recall conversations from decades ago with perfect detail. Other days, she struggled to remember names of people who had been central to her life. The most painful part was confronting the mistakes. In creating an honest account of her life, Sharon had to revisit decisions that had hurt people, moments when her fierce protectiveness had crossed into cruelty, times when her single-minded focus on success had damaged relationships that mattered. The process of taking responsibility for a lifetime of complicated choices while her ability to process complex emotions was declining was almost unbearable. Sharon also became obsessed with charitable giving, wanting to ensure that the Osbourne wealth would do good in the world after she was gone. She established foundations focused on Parkinson's research, addiction treatment, and supporting families dealing with neurological diseases. Every dollar donated felt like a small victory against meaninglessness, proof that her life had created value beyond entertainment. The reconciliation efforts began then too. Sharon reached out to people she'd hurt over the years, industry figures she'd clashed with, former employees who'd left on bad terms. Not all of them responded, and some conversations went badly, but Sharon persisted. She was trying to clear the air while she still could, to repair what damage was repairable before time ran out completely. Kelly and Amy responded differently to their mother's obvious decline. Kelly threw herself into helping, becoming Sharon's memory when it failed, her voice when she couldn't find words, her strength when the frustration became overwhelming. But Amy pulled back even further, seemingly unable to watch her formidable mother become vulnerable and fragile. The hardest conversation came with Ozzy himself during one of his clearer moments. Sharon tried to explain what was happening to her, why she was making all these preparations, why their life together was about to change dramatically. His response was typically direct and devastating. "I can't lose you too, Sharon. You're all I have left of myself." That night, Sharon made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She wasn't going to fade quietly into medical care and family management. If time was running out, if her mind was going to betray her, if her legacy was going to be defined by controversy and decline, then she was going to fight back in the only way she knew how. She was going to tell her story completely and honestly while she still could. Not the sanitized version that publicists preferred, not the dramatic narrative that made for good television, but the real story of Sharon Osbourne. The victories and the failures, the love and the damage, the empire built and the prices paid. Because if Sharon had learned anything in 72 years of surviving the unthinkable, it was that the truth, no matter how complicated or painful, was the only thing that couldn't be taken away from her. And she was going to make sure that truth survived, even if she didn't. Sharon Osbourne's story isn't over yet. Her fight against time and illness continues, showing us that resilience isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up even when everything seems lost. Share this video if Sharon's courage inspires you, and subscribe for more untold stories of legends who refuse to surrender.